In this video, I'm going to talk about character creation. There's some timestamps in the description, and let's go ahead and get into what you're here for. There are a few considerations when it comes to creating and building a character. First, the out-of-character and in-character distinction. The way we are communicating right now is known as out-of-character. Well, I'm speaking to you as Greg, and we both are players. We're players in an MMORPG. When I refer to your character, I'm mainly referring in the context of role-playing as the character that you plan to engage with others within an immersive environment, acting out the things that that character would do, whereas you and I, we are players. Will you make a new character? Many role players, myself included, often role-play on a main character. However, it's also not uncommon to make other characters for role-play as well, so you have different people to play with, different identities, different backgrounds, or even different purposes, themes, and goals. That being said, the other thing we need to keep in mind, as kind of an axiom when it comes to creating characters, is the avatar and roleplay disconnect. We are not the characters we play as when it comes to roleplaying. You and I are players of the game. When it comes to our characters we play as, we need to think and act as they think and they act, and we need to not let our interactions with others bleed into our out-of-character personas. So for example, if someone is a very mean pirate kind of character and acts very mean to your character, that doesn't mean that they're being mean to you out of character, or at least they most certainly shouldn't. It's good to have a healthy disconnect between your character that you play with and you yourself, because that's the way in which you interact with the world. You may find it very limiting if your character is simply a self-insert. Now, many people will use characters for the sake of, self-discovery and identity. However, the problem can be is that can lead to conflict down the road. We may perceive certain things that are attributes of another's character as something insulting to our ego, to our player, ourselves. And we want to make sure that doesn't happen. So always keep in mind a healthy disconnect between the out-of-character and the in-character. The two are separate things and never should they meet. That's referred to as out-of-character bleed. And this should be an aspect of freedom. You can make any kind of character that you can think of, anything you can dream up. You don't have to be that in real life. In fact, I can even talk a bit about occupations and role-playing different occupations in another video. You don't need to be an expert on a topic to role-play an expert, just to kind of give you some perspective. Now that we've talked about considerations, let's talk about the essentials. You're going to need to decide what kind of roleplay you intend to do with this character. And this typically spans between two things, which may be dichotomous, but sometimes they intermix. This is going to span either between social or progressive. For a social character, you're often going to be interacting with others in more open role-playing events. You're typically going to be interacting with people in bars and clubs and taverns and different hosting events that are advertised in shout chats and throughout the different housing and apartment communities. You're going to be interacting with characters through walk-up roleplay. And that's kind of more the mold of the social character. Typically, social characters can already have an established place within the world of the role-playing game that you're playing. Social characters typically can already be established warriors and gladiators and adventurers who've earned more than a few notches on their belts. These are the characters that you enter into a story with others already having experience. In contrast to this are progressive characters. And if you plan to join a progressive role-playing community, one that's focused on adventuring and moving up the ranks and getting stronger over time, making a progression-based character means that you're going to start at the bottom, along with everyone else who joins that role-playing community, be it a guild in SWTOR, or joining into an adventure-themed guild in World of Warcraft or Free Company in Final Fantasy XIV. Many times you start at 0. The weakest you can possibly be. There's usually a dice system associated, and you're going to start at the lowest roll of the dice that there is because everyone else has already put in the work within that guild. The progression of that guild is actually what makes it very fun, because you eventually grow in the stories that you tell with others. Another difference between social and progression characters is expansion versus growth. Social characters are typically pre-established, as we talked about. Therefore, a lot of their interaction with others is expansion. Expansion on a character that already exists within the world. Whereas when it comes to progression-based roleplay, the characters typically are more about growth. Because they start from the bottom, there's nowhere for them to go but up. Therefore, a lot of times the roleplay that you encounter there is focused on the character's growth. They learn, they develop, they grow, and somewhat expand as well. However, you're going to find that when you make a progression-based character, often they turn out quite different than you expected, and that's part of that character growing up. And then finally, as you're going through this, you need a reason to be here. And again, this is important when it comes to the distinction of social and progression-based characters. For social characters, like I mentioned, they're already established, so you can give them any reason to be there. When it comes to progression-based characters, you need to kind of think of a general starting point. For example, if you're bringing a new character into an adventuring guild, how did they get to that point of joining that guild? Perhaps they encountered a fierce monster that wiped out part of their family and they couldn't combat it. And so they wanted to enlist, with a bunch of adventurers so they could hopefully help others avoid the same tragedy they encountered. Things like that. Just the most basic reason for your character to show up and ready to roleplay. Now comes the fun part of creating your character. Now, if you want, you can actually make a document on a computer, such as Google Docs, or even an Excel spreadsheet to host your character sheet. I personally, I use Excel spreadsheet, but you can even use something as simple as a notepad on your phone, just so you can jot down some essentials about your character, keep track of who they are, what kind of person they are, what kind of stuff they have. And if you're in a progressive guild and a heavy role-playing guild, it's going to be very important to keep track of things like your dice, your modifiers, your different skills and proficiencies, things like that, your loot. You want to have a nice place to keep track of all of that. Now, when it comes to character creation itself, the most important question is this: who am I? Who am I? My name is Alan. I'm an explorer that just got in from a trip overseas. I traveled all across the ocean to finally get here to La Noscea, and I'm thinking about opening up a shop. So something as simple as that. Now, the next consideration is going to be your character's race. What race and sub-race are there? Well, depending on the game you're playing, you usually have a good number of selections. In Final Fantasy XIV, you have a good number of races as well as sub-races, and each of them have a little bit of a write-up as far as what the lore is for that sub-race, for both the race and the sub-race itself, to kind of give you an example. This is also a good time to start thinking of a name. Now, ideally, you want to have your character that you name in the game have a lore-friendly name. Thankfully, in Final Fantasy XIV, the name generation feature makes very lore-friendly names for both race and sub-race. Next is going to be your consideration of gender, or perhaps you've already made this consideration upon choosing your race. Gender is something that you don't have to be consistent with out of character. Statistics show that the majority of characters created in MMORPGs typically is female, whereas the majority of players who play MMORPGs typically identify as male. Feel free to make any gender that you want. People typically make the kind of character they enjoy looking at, whether it's humorous, whether it's cool looking, or whether it's attractive to them. It's as simple as that. You want to, at the same time, start going into appearance. Imagine that you're sitting within the quicksands in Ul'dah, and suddenly your character comes walking in through the door. You turn your head and you look over at them, and what is it that you see? Describe what it is, briefly to yourself, what it is you see when you perceive your character walking in through that door. What do they look like? What does their appearance immediately tell you? Do they look rough? Do they smell like they've been outdoors all day? Maybe they smell a bit like the woods, if they're quite a bit of a hunter. Maybe they smell real fragrant. Perhaps they wear a military type uniform of some sorts. Imagine that character comes over and speaks to you directly over at the bar. What does their voice sound like? What kind of dialogue do they use? What about their word choice? They speak with an accent? And what about their mannerisms? How close do they get when they talk to you? Do they scratch their cheek when they get nervous? Do they have a twitch? But it's good to kind of put some of that characteristics into the appearance of that character. After all, the way you interact with others, you want to express and pull that out. That's part of what adds flavor and spice to your characters. And then I can talk more about characterization and expression in a future video. But all that is very important when it comes to appearance. I hope this video was helpful. I'll be making more videos on similar subjects such as expressing your character and playing them, writing them, some tips and tricks that I've learned while role-playing, and some unique and creative stuff you can do. All sorts of things like that, because I think there's a lot of fun to be had there. Thanks for watching. Bye.